Hello, my friends. My name is Hannah and happy non-fiction November. Now, if you're in the same boat as me, you might be struggling to muster the enthusiasm for non-fiction November this year. November for me is very busy this year with work, and I struggle to get myself into a non-fiction-y headspace, but I do want to read more non-fiction. There's lots that I want to do, and sort of this video is almost going to be a reminder to myself that I have read and enjoyed lots of non-fiction, and not all non-fiction has to be heavy, intimidating, difficult books about gnarly topics. Now, absolutely, those books are important, and I have some on my shelf that I do want to tackle, but possibly, probably, for me, not this month. So in this video, I am going to be very quickly talking you through some different types of nonfiction that you might want to look to that are a little bit, I don't want to say more accessible to imply that nonfiction isn't accessible, or to imply that the books I'm going to be talking about are somehow not as substantial, but just some different types of nonfiction that you might want to try and pick up, particularly if you are a little bit of a reluctant nonfiction reader, or just someone who hasn't read a lot of nonfiction and is interested in reading more. And I've kind of loosely grouped these into different categories. I have my handy scrawled list here. All of these books are books that I have read and enjoyed in the past, so there will be way more examples of each kind of nonfiction. It's just I'm not going to recommend something that I haven't read myself, and if I am talking about a book that I haven't read yet, I will specify that I haven't read it yet. So the categories we're going to kind of cover are what I like to call literary adjacent books, memoir, including celebrity memoir, because, you know, we're going to mention some celebrity memoirs. Essay collections and kind of social commentary, anthropology type stuff. What I've kind of called like literary true crime. Although some of it is just true crime, some of it is just true crime. And some kind of gentle science / nature stuff. So they're the categories that we're going to be dipping our toe into. Let's go. We'll start with literary adjacent because it's a small little category, but it is one that I recommend if you are a fiction reader and someone who reads a lot of fiction. This can be a really nice entry point into reading more non-fiction, and it is simply, as I define it, works that are either about books or, particularly for me, other writings by fiction writers that you like. So, for example, the love letters between Vita Sackville West and Virginia Woolf. If you were a fan of either of those women's writing, then this is a lovely edition of their letters that just kind of gives you an overarching chronology of their relationship. And it's lovely, and it's really well put together and edited, and really it contextualizes all of the letters and things that were going on really well. So there are things like that, and also Daemon voices. If you're a fan of Philip Pullman's work, particularly his Dark Materials, then I do recommend this essay collection by Philip Pullman. It was really interesting. All of the essays are about writing. It's not necessarily all about his Dark Materials, but there are some essays that he's talking about, like how he came up with some of the elements of the story. So it's kind of the literary equivalent of watching like the bonus features on a DVD. Think of it like that. Really showing my age there with the DVD reference, but okay, you know, you get it. And other books that I'd put in this category are also kind of non-fiction that has a really strong storytelling aspect. I would say if you are someone who normally reads a lot of myth retelling sort of fiction, a Madeline Miller fan, a Natalie Haynes fan, I would actually really recommend Natalie Haynes' non-fiction. So her book Pandora's Jar does tell the stories of a number of women from Greek mythology, but she's also looking at how presentations of those women have changed over time in a kind of social commentary way, which is really interesting. And her latest book, which is here, divine might is doing the same for goddesses in Greek mythology. Disclaimer for that one, I haven't actually read Divine Might, but I'm sure it's brilliant because I love everything that Natalie Haynes does. So you may well not be a particular fan of those authors that I've mentioned, but it is worth looking at what other writings some of your favourite novelists or poets do as a nice, smooth entry point into non-fiction. And then the other obvious place to look is memoir. So these are just some of the memoirs that I've read, particularly over the last couple of years, that I've particularly enjoyed, or that I think would be particularly good for someone who normally reads fiction. So if you're a fan of literary fiction in particular, I really recommend In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. Now this is, do check the trigger warnings for this memoir because it's very, it is dealing with abuse, but it is a brilliant collection that kind of fuses essay, poetry, really lyrical writing with memoir, and is a really powerful book. So I think that is a good place to go. Again, for the, particularly if you enjoy very literary writing, I think maybe my favourite memoir that I have ever read is Priest Daddy by Patricia Lockwood. This is about a period of, it's a specific period of time in Patricia Lockwood's life where she's had to move back home with her parents as an adult because her husband, they're American, her husband was really unwell and their medical bills were really expensive, which meant that they didn't have a lot of money and they decided to move back home so that they could better finance his healthcare. And her dad was a preacher when she grew up, but has since converted to Catholicism. And it's about her reflections of being a child, but then also her experience being back in that house. And I absolutely love Patricia Lockwood's writing style. She will make you laugh and then sob within like the space of a page. It's amazing. So I really recommend that. Other memoirs that I really like are, Michael Rosen. If you're a fan of Michael Rosen's Many Different Kinds of Love, again a bit like Priest Daddy, a memoir about a very specific time in Michael's life. He was really poorly right at the start of the pandemic. He contracted COVID and it made him very unwell. He was in a coma for a really long time, and Many Different Kinds of Love tracks his recovery from that, but it also includes notes and kind of messages that his nurses and caregivers were writing while he was unconscious, and it made me absolutely bawl, but it is brilliant. So definitely recommend that. I also really enjoyed Michelle T's memoir, Knocking Myself Up, which is a really very specifically looking at her fertility journey. And so obviously, again, if that's particularly difficult for you to read about, then maybe steer clear of this one. But it was really interesting, particularly as Michelle is a queer woman and was trying to navigate getting pregnant in a non-heteronormative way. And that was really interesting. Michelle T is very funny. So that is a great one. Also surprisingly funny, I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. Now that I know is a memoir that was absolutely everywhere earlier this year and last year, and I'm just going to be another voice saying, yeah, it's a really engaging, interesting read, but absolutely check trigger warnings because that one has a lot of content that might be upsetting for some people. I also really enjoyed Brood by Jackie Polson. This is a much quieter, more introspective memoir than some of the others, and is ostensibly about Jackie taking care of a brood of chickens. So if you're into saving chickens, this may also be the book for you. Finally, some celebrity memoirs, because I mean, why the hell not? I'm not a big one for reading celebrity memoirs. it's not like my favorite kind of memoir, but I have read some over the years that I do really like. First up, With Nails, which is Richard E. Grant's film diaries, very specifically. So if you were a fan of particularly his earlier film work, these are diaries that he kept early on in his career, particularly during the filming of With Nail and I, which, you know, absolutely a cult favourite. But I'm pretty sure Spice World is also in that book. I haven't read it for a really long time. I think I was about 18 when I read it, because I was slap bang in the middle of my big With Nail and I phase. But it was really, really good. But do check trigger warnings for that as well. In fact, you know what? I'm going to stop saying that. With memoir, especially, check trigger warnings if you need to for anything you're going to be picking up, but particularly with memoir and the ones that I'm going to go on talking about. Yeah, check trigger warnings for all of these. I also really enjoyed may not be the word actually, but really appreciated My Name Is Why by Lem Sissay. This is Lem's reflection particularly of his childhood growing up in the care system, and he has requested his records, his social care records, and so interspersed between some poetry and some prose that Lem has written are also extracts from his social care files, and it is very, very upsetting reading at some point, but it is really, really beautifully done. And then similarly upsetting, Just Ignore Him by Alan Davies. Now, I have a really big soft spot for Alan Davies. Jonathan Creek was like one of my favorite things on TV growing up. I thought it was like so cool. But his memoir is a difficult read, and he had a very, very difficult upbringing. And so be warned going into it, but I really found it very, very powerful. Also, again, you'll spot a pattern here. I only really read celebrity memoirs if it's a celebrity that I really like. So another one I absolutely loved was And Away by Bob Mortimer. I adore Bob Mortimer, like, to my core. I love that man. And his autobiography, And Away, was brilliant, and absolutely, please, if you're going to read this book, listen to the audiobook, because there is nothing better than hearing Bob make himself laugh with some of the anecdotes from his life. But there are also, they also tackle some really big, difficult topics in that book as well. And finally, if you're a MasterChef fan, particularly, I loved Hungry by Grace Dent. I just think Grace is fucking so cool. It's a really interesting book because Grace comes from quite working class background, and how she got into food criticism is not necessarily a straightforward road. It was really interesting to read about. So those are some of the memoirs that I would recommend. Essay collections, I also think, are a brilliant way in. Oh, I forgot. I missed Sitting Pretty by Rebecca Taussig, which actually links beautifully because I was about to talk about essay collections. And Sitting Pretty by Rebecca Taussig is sort of a memoir as an essay collection, or essay collection as memoir. But it's particularly about her experience as a wheelchair user. And she founded the Sitting Pretty movement on Instagram, which is very cool. And she's another very funny, very incisive, but very sensitive writer. And I really recommend that. So other essay collections that I recommend are earlier this year, or maybe last year, I read A Burst of Light and Other Essays by Audre Lorde. It was the first Audre Lorde I've ever read, shamefully. But I really, really enjoyed it. It was sort of depressing to read. Some of her essays obviously tackling things like intersectional feminism and the experience of queer people, and particularly queer people who are racialized. It was depressing to read how little has changed since her time of writing. But they were, I mean, she's an absolute legend. So that was really great. One that I am maybe hoping to get to this November, maybe, but that I haven't read yet. Again, absolute classic, is Letters to My Daughter by Maya Angelou. I don't know why this is the one book that I pulled off of my shelf. But this is, they are a series of essays, but sort of dedicated to a daughter that Maya Angelou never had. And so I'm really looking forward to getting to that at some point. If you're kind of into pop culture, and particularly kind of feminist or queer takes on pop culture, I really recommend Girls Can Kiss Now by Jill Gutowitz. I really enjoyed that. I listened to that as an audiobook. I also, in my wrap-up last month, if you've seen that, you'll know that I was a big fan of Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino, which again is looking a lot at identity, particularly around social media and the internet and things like that. And it was very, very good. Then moving on to some other books that are kind of similar themes to those essay collections, but aren't essay collections, are full books. I literally, just before recording this, finished Butts, a Backstory by Heather Radke, which is, as it sounds, a book about the derriere. And it was so interesting. So Heather is sort of charting our social relationship with particularly women's bums, and the various trends that have come and gone, and how that intersects with feminism and also with race. And it was really, really interesting, and I really recommend it. So there's that. It reminded me quite a bit at some points of that book of Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell, which was another book that's looking at sort of big issues in society by focusing down on a particular thing, where Heather Radke did butts, Amanda Montell did language. So she's looking at the language of cults and the language of fanaticism, and it was really, really interesting. I feel like I'm saying really, really interesting quite a lot, and I'm sorry about that. And finally, I think if you're a fan of like a Louis Theroux style documentary and you haven't read anything by Jon Ronson before, you may particularly be interested in those. I really enjoyed, I think the one of his I enjoyed the most is So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which sort of, he wrote it kind of, I think, in the early days of when cancel culture really started becoming a thing. So it could do with being a little bit more up to date given where we are now, but it was still really, really interesting. I think his most famous book is The Psychopath Test, though, which brings me neatly onto true crime adjacent books. I used to listen to quite a lot of true crime like podcasts and stuff, and I think I just totally burnt myself out of it, and it's not a genre that I read a lot of, but I have read a few bits and pieces that are kind of in that area recently that I have enjoyed. So a couple of books that feel more like novels are Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil by John Barron. This is a really interesting book set in, oh god, she's gonna remember, I think is it Savannah in Georgia? I'm pretty sure it's Savannah. And there has been a crime that's taken place, but it's really more about the kind of characters that are involved. Lots of really interesting character portrayals in that, but it was non-fiction, but it didn't really feel like non-fiction. Similarly, I mean, an absolute classic in this genre, something like In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. But then a few other bits and pieces that you might, I mean, a really popular book again, The Five by Hallie Rubenhold, which sort of tells the previously untold story of the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper, and gives them their space to be seen and understood. So that is a great one if you're a true crime fiend. Also, My Friend Anna by Rachel Deloach Williams. So this is, if you've seen the Netflix series with Ruth Garner, where I can't remember the woman's name now. Anna Delvey, that's it, Anna Delvey, who sort of was this European woman who ended up conning people out of loads and loads of money and was an absolute fraud. And Rachel Deloach Williams was one of the people who were taken in by her and lost an incredible amount of money. And this is her kind of story. So it's kind of true crime / memoir, that one. So there's a few things there, but like I said, I don't read tons in that area. But I know it is a very popular in terms of documentaries and in terms of podcasts. So I would suggest if you do listen to a lot of stuff in that area, or you watch a lot of documentaries, that then it might be an area that you want to explore to pick up some nonfiction this month. Finally, some sort of loosely science / nature books. So I read earlier this year, I really enjoyed Tamed by Alice Roberts, which is the history of how humans have tamed and cultivated certain crops and animals, and the history of that, what it tells us about how human civilizations have developed, and I really enjoyed that. I also absolutely loved, if you want something very gentle, I really enjoyed The Stubborn Light of Things by Melissa Harrison. Yes, I've just written completely the wrong name down and confused myself. But yeah, by Melissa Harrison. She's a beautiful nature writer. And she's sort of basically just a book about her relocating to East Anglia, I think, after having lived in London for a while. I also really liked, if you're an art fan, I really enjoyed Spring Cannot Be Cancelled, which is a series of interviews between Martin Gayford and David Hockney, but they take place at David Hockney's home in France in the springtime. So I'd also really recommend this book if you are someone who doesn't deal too well with the drawing in of the nights and the days getting much shorter, and you want some joy and vibrancy in springtime. This may well be a book for you, particularly obviously if you're a fan of David Hockney. You may want to check that one out. Totally unrelated to nature, but again, if you're interested in kind of human psychology or just kind of medical curios, I really recommend Oliver Sacks's books. In particular, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat is quite a good one, because that is lots of different cases that Oliver Sacks has covered over time, and is a good one for kind of dipping in and out if you don't want to read a full book. I also found Musicophilia was really, really interesting, which was a book about various different neurological conditions to do with music and hearing, and I really enjoyed that. And then finally, if you want a book that is about climate change, but is a bit more, not so much going to give you the hard facts. Maybe you're not quite ready for the hard facts, or maybe you know the hard facts, but you're struggling to contextualize or enact any of that. I really recommend We Are the Weather by Jonathan Safran Foer. This is bringing me around beautifully because he's obviously more famously a novelist, but I really enjoyed We Are the Weather. It's sort of about grappling with the difficulty of enacting change, because human beings don't like doing that. And before he wrote We Are the Weather, he wrote a book called Eating Animals, which was all about why we shouldn't eat animals. And while he was touring that book, found that he was still eating meat, even though he didn't want to and he knew he shouldn't. He was still eating meat. And so We Are the Weather is sort of more about confronting your ability, the human ability to be hypocritical and contradictory, and how we can start to get over some of those things. Which brings me on to a bit of extra places that you might want to go, but also a little bit about my plans for Nonfiction November. So linked to We Are the Weather, Lena Norms over on her channel, if you want to read climate books but you can't bring yourself to read climate books, she's got a brilliant podcast called No Books on a Dead Planet, where every episode her and a guest read a big climate book and then discuss it. So it's a good way of getting the vibe of a non-fiction book about climate change, but also to get some of the headline information or kind of key arguments of each book without you yourself having to read it, or it can just simply signpost you to which one might be a good pick for you. Lena did a really good video recently of the best books she's read on climate change, the climate crisis, and I think my plan for later on in Nonfiction November might be to tackle some of those on audio while I desperately try to finish a number of craft projects that I have started over the course of this year and haven't finished yet, and really would like to be finished before the end of the year. So that might be something that I look to do, I think, for my Nonfiction November. I also actually recommend, as a side note, the 404 Inklings series. I've mentioned them before on my channel. They're really good little introductory short little books. You won't be able to tell from the cover, so let me show you some. They're tiny. They're really, really small. So they're a good place to go if you want to maybe dip your toe into a topic before tackling a really big book. So she's knocked her toucan. There you go. There's some recommendations for non-fiction books. These are obviously all books I've read. If you have read similar non-fiction to any of the ones I read that you think I might like, then I would love to hear those recommendations in the comments down below. But also, what non-fiction do you like reading? Are you planning on reading anything for Nonfiction November? I imagine you are, otherwise, you curious creature, what are you doing here if you're not planning on reading any non-fiction? Yeah, please let me know in the comments down below, and happy non-fiction reading. See you later, friends. Bye.